What's up, everybody? Renfail here. Welcome to the channel if this is your first time, and if you're a returning visitor, welcome back. Today, we are diving into EverQuest 2 once again with another game guide, and today it's all about which class should I play? That is a fun question to answer because a lot of it is going to be determined by what you enjoy doing. And with mercenaries in the game these days, at least in the classic traditional servers that are open to the public or free to play, etc., 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 having a mercenary at your disposal means that there are a lot more options in terms of playing solo. But then there's the consideration of, are you going to be grouping? Are you going to be grouping with friends? Are you going to have a full group of friends? Or are you still going to be two or three of you who are also using mercenaries? Are you going to be raiding, or are you just going to be doing quests and groups? There's a lot of factors into this equation. Now, for the purposes of this video, we are not discussing the progression servers because it's a whole nother beast, and I have other content around the progression servers. So this is for classic traditional servers like Antonia Bale as an example, which is one of the legacy servers that has been open since the game went live. They're free to play. Anyone can jump in there and create a character and go from there. There's alternate advancement, all sorts of crazy stuff. So the other caveat to this video today is that I'm not going to be showing any combat in this video. Why? Because there's combat in the class guides that I do. So if you want to see combat, you can check out the class guides, or you can tune into one of the live streams because I stream and have streamed in the past a lot of EverQuest and EverQuest 2. So if you need to see combat, if you need to see some of these classes in action, go watch the streams. Along with the class guides, you'll get all the combat you needed. Today's discussion is literally just that. It's a discussion about all of the various classes and what class you might want to consider playing if you're jumping into this game for the first time. Or if you're a returning player who's never played before and you're sitting here going, you know what, when I played the game back at launch, I played, a paladin, but now I'm 15 years older and I want to try out something different. I like melee, or I like casters, or X, Y, or Z. That's what we're here to discuss today. So if that sounds like your cup of tea, like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss an update, and let's dive in to the actual video. Alright folks, now that the intro's out of the way, I'm going to be killing the camera so that you can not see my face anymore, because I need you to be able to see all this important stuff that's on the screen here. So hopefully that doesn't bother you, that you're not going to see this ugly mug anymore. You might see me again at the end of the video, but in the meantime, we're going to dive into the next part of this discussion, which is archetypes. So EverQuest 2 has classes, but those classes are grouped into archetypes that are broken down into 4 different types: fighter, priest, mage, and scout. Now, you might think that it's as simple as going, well, I want to play some sort of a fighter, or I want to play some type of a priest, or, whatever, go down the list. But the reality is that there are a lot of variants within each one of these archetypes because all the classes bring something different to the table. So it's not as easy as just going, let's pick an archetype and go from there, because once you pick an archetype, you then need to say, okay, well, using the fighter as an example, within the fighters, there are 6 different groupings. So if you're looking at the classes within the fighter, you've got Guardian, Berserker, Monk, Bruiser, Paladin, Shadow Knight. Essentially, that gets broken down into 3 different categories. Do you want to be a straight-up melee tank? Do you want to be a DPS warrior, or do you want to be a hybrid tank? Actually, 4 categories, because technically the Berserker is its own thing as well. So that's the way to look at that. So even though there are archetypes, it's more about the classes. Now, this is going to be kind of a speed run, and we're going to be going through each one of these categories. So first and foremost, we're going to talk about the fighters. So you have the Guardian. And right off the bat, this is a class that I've raided with many times over the years. I was the main tank in our guild during the heyday of EverQuest 2, back through the Kunark expansion, when we were all getting our mythicals, back when that content was fresh and live. And I played since launch as a Dwarven Guardian, Thanon Rockguard. The Guardian was and is in my mind, best mitigation tank in the game, bar none. It is what I consider to be the ultimate raid tank. And people are going to have different degrees of discussion on that, and that's fine. But in my mind, the Guardian has always been the best shield tank out there in terms of pure mitigation value. The DPS used to suck, but these days you can have a mercenary doing DPS for you. So if you like the whole shield wall, like sword and board type scenario, the Guardian is definitely going to be what you want to play. If you're going to be playing with a group, it's even better because you'll be able to control all the aggro with taunts and everything else. It's a great way to be at the forefront. Now, the counter to that is the Berserker, which I always found weird because technically the Berserker is not what I would consider to be a main tank, even though they can wear heavy armor and they do have some threats at their disposal, some taunts. The Berserker is more about just DPS, doing lots and lots of DPS with two-handed weapons or what have you, and just being a frontline tank that can do tons of DPS. It can absolutely tank in dungeons. I would not personally put a Berserker as the raid tank, but they do a great job as an off tank on raids or as the main assist calling out targets and stuff. But definitely a good tank for groups, but it's mostly about the DPS there. Monks and bruisers are in, and it's going to depend on who you talk to and how you're playing. Monks and bruisers have some of the best DPS in the game, bar none. They are melee DPS, and it just kind of depends on how you want to play them. The monk, as it says, a spiritual combatant, and the bruiser is a juggernaut of strength and intimidation, who have transformed their bodies into vicious weapons to inflict pain and suffering upon their enemies. They rely on deflection and agility, and monks rely on hastening their formidable attacks. Monks are just melee DPS, and even though they're in the fighter category, they are not tanks. They can tank in a pinch, but they're not going to be anything that I would consider to be raid tanks. They do tons of damage, though, and they're a great frontline fighter to have in your group alongside whatever is going to be your main tank for the party. Then we get into paladins and shadow knights, and this just really depends on whether or not you want to be a quote-unquote good guy or a quote-unquote bad guy. Paladins have their self-heals and do a really good job of aggro, and are, in my mind, the second best group tank in the game, whereas the Shadow Knight is all about AoE damage and also life taps, and in my mind are the second best raid tanks in the game. Now that's again up for debate, but this is my guide, so that's what I'm talking about. So the Shadow Knight is also equal to the Guardian, Paladin, Berserker. All the plate tanks are going to be equal in terms of group tanking. I actually think that the Shadow Knight is the funnest out of all of these to play because the AoEs are absolutely destructive, and it's really cool to just gather up, a dozen mobs and just mow them down as a Shadow Knight. It's a hell of a lot of fun, and I think I mentioned this in the one of the class guides I did. The Shadow Knight, like if you do an Ixar Shadow Knight, it's one of the funnest things ever. They look really cool in the plate mail. All right, now that we're into the priest category, let's start off with the plate healers, which are the Templar and the Inquisitor. And these are essentially the same thing, but they're on either side of the board. We got the Templars on the good side and the Inquisitors on the quote-unquote bad side. These are main heals, and it's going to be a combination of direct heals and these kind of defensive proc heals. But they both heal equally well. It just depends on what you want to be doing. The Inquisitor, I find, has a little bit more DPS than the Templar. But again, this is kind of like good and evil. Like you can only play a Templar if you're good or neutral, and you can only play Inquisitor if you're a neutral or bad. So you can't play these characters on the other side of the equation. They are split into factions. Now, outside of that, you have your leather healers, which are broken down into the Warden or the Fury. Again, two sides of the same coin. You have the Warden, which deals a lot with regenerative healing and the forces of nature. They do a great job at doing melee DPS as well, and I talked about this in the best solo class guide that I did. The Wardens, at least as of 2023, still top the list as one of the best solo classes to play because of the fact that their AoEs are amazing with melee, and they can just wade in and just decimate things while self-healing. It's pretty amazing. Furies, on the other hand, have regenerative healing, but also buffs that enhance the your allies, and they do a little bit of DPS with dots and stuff. I previously, at one point in time, had boxed. I think it was on I think it was the Caledon progression server. I boxed a Shadow Knight and Fury, and that combo was just absolutely deadly. Like it's one of the coolest things I've ever done. Outside of that, you have your chain wielding or chain wearing healers, which are the Mystic and the Defiler. Now, These two are, again, different sides of the same coin. They are the shamanic, or the shamanic, however you want to pronounce that, healers. The mystic, both these rely upon wards, essentially. You're warding your target against um, damage, and there are some heals and everything else, but I find that the Defiler is more geared towards, like it says here, fearsome battle, the Defiler employs ancient rituals of dark power to sicken, harm, and reduce the fighting prowess of the enemy, so it's lots of debuffs and dots. Mystic has a little bit more buffing on their allies, but can do equal amounts of DPS. So it just kind of depends on, again, do you want to be good or evil? Because Mystic is good, Defiler is evil. And if you guys hear a cat in the background, it's because Frodo is asking for something. So, all right, let's move on to the next. Hey everyone, Renfail here with the commercial part of the video where I say, hey, if you like this, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that bell icon so you never miss an update. And thanks to all of our supporters here on YouTube and over on Patreon, our highest members, our guild champions, Crazy's Relative, Remy D here on YouTube. And don't forget, if you want to support, it's really easy. You can do the memberships below, the Adventurers Guild, 3 different tiers. There's also the super thanks on any uploaded video or YouTube short that you find. There's also, of course, the super chats and stickers that you could do on any live stream or premiere, and the Patreon page if you want to dive into the fantasy world that I have with my brother and my wife, which is a tabletop game, a point-and-click adventure game, and a fantasy book series. All are great ways to keep this channel going and me going full-time. Thanks again for those of you who support. Let's get back to the video that you're watching now. Next up are the mages. Now, this is where things get really fun, because all of the mages are about ranged DPS, but the type of DPS they do is distinctly different. So the wizards are all about straight up nukes. So if you like doing lots of single target damage, then the wizard is going to be for you. It is all about just pulling down huge amounts of damage of fire and ice per mana. Meanwhile, the warlock does a lot of AoEs. So again, it's sort of like good versus evil type of thing, sort of, but not really. But anyway, wizard is single target, warlock is AoE. So these are the two you have to keep in mind between those two. Then you have the difference between the illusionist and the coercer. So both of these can do crowd control to some degree, but again, EverQuest 2 has not been a game that relies upon crowd control for many, many, many years. You do not need to mez like you did in EverQuest 1, so this is mostly about just being a different type of caster. So illusionists use their mental acuity to confuse, misdirect, and subdue their opponents. Okay. The other one is the coercer. By the way, there is some power regen associated with the illusionist as well. Meanwhile, the coercer is all about subduing enemies, sending them into a paralyzing state of fascination, or causing them to flee. And they are all about, taking control over unwitting creatures. So it's just kind of, the illusionist has a few more buffs at their disposal compared to the coercer. The coercer has a little bit more DPS, but they're both based around the idea of controlling the minds of mobs. And helping in combat as opposed to doing direct damage through DPS. Then you get into the 2 pet mages, and I talked about this in the best solo class guide. The difference between the conjurer and the necromancer, in my opinion, is mostly in the pets. Otherwise, they're essentially the same class, just on either side of the coin. They're both all about DPS and pets. The conjurer has more pets at their disposal, and their pets tend to be I would say their pets tend to be a little tougher because of the fact that you have different, you have your earth pet, air pet, so on and so forth, and their stats vary depending on what type of elemental pet you're pulling out. Meanwhile, you have the necromancer who has, they have their own versions of undead servants, which do different kind of things. But the necromancer is all about sort of dots, and the conjurer is more like single target DPS with some AoE stuff. But it's mostly about doing DPS in elemental ways as opposed to the necromancer, which is lots of death magic and DOTs. Both are equally fun to play. Both are equally deadly. I'd say if I had to pick between the two, the necromancer is going to be more DPS than the conjurer, but the conjurer has their pets are far more survivable, if that makes sense. So if you're wanting to rely more on your pet, then you're probably going to go with the conjurer, but if you want to do more DPS, you're probably going to go the necromancer. Finally, we get into the scouts, and this is where things are going to be a little a little different because the scouts play completely differently depending on what you're talking about here. So the swashbuckler is, they're dual wielding. They do pretty good DPS. There's a lot of stealth going on, misdirection, so on and so forth. It's a good, just fun melee DPS class. The brigand is similar. But they can also do a little bit of debuffing to the mobs and through sneak attacks and stuff. So they're, again, both sides of the same coin. Just depends on whether or not you're playing in the Freeport side or the Kino side. It's the way it used to be. These days there are neutral races as well. Then we get into the I still don't know why they have Beast Lords down here in with the two bards, other than maybe that was just the place where they wanted to stick it. Beast Lord is a pet class, so it's a combination of like a mystic and a monk, so to speak, and they are melee DPS with a pet at their disposal. So I mean, they're really good DPS. They can be extremely deadly. So if you like having a pet at your disposal, but you also want to have some spells like a mystic, that's going to be a way to roll. Now between the bards, the troubadour is so both of these are DPS classes, but the troubadour's songs are more geared towards providing your party with buffs that help out with casters. So your healers or your magic DPS. The dirge, on the other hand, has buffs that are more geared towards the melee members of your party. So this is the way to think about these two, even though they are great DPSers in their own right. Actually, they're good DPS. I wouldn't call them great. They're decent DPS. They're mostly buff bots. And honestly, most people who play a bard are playing a bard because they're going to be in a party of other people. And so they're playing a specific style of bard that's going to suit the members of the party that they're in. So if it's a melee heavy party, you're going to go dirge. If it's a caster heavy party, you're going to go troubadour. They are equally fun to play. I've played a bard. I played a troubadour couple of different times, and they're a lot of fun to have at your disposal. My favorite class in the whole game is the Ranger. It's range DPS. It's a lot of fun. You can do melee DPS, but it's mostly about combining the two. I tend to play mine purely ranged, although you can get up and do some melee DPS as needed. Excuse me. Yawns for the win. And then the Assassin is pure up close and personal. Probably outside of the monks, the Assassin is the single most deadly DPS in the game, but it is all about melee DPS. You got to be up close and personal in combat, and you need a good tank because somebody's going to need to be keeping the aggro so that you can constantly be behind the mobs doing stab, stab, stabbity, stab. You can play an Assassin solo simply because these days the tank mercenaries do a great job of holding aggro, but you may have to tailor your DPS just a little bit because the tank NPCs aren't perfect. So that's something to keep in mind when you are playing. So there you have it, everyone. That is my overview on what class you might want to play in EverQuest 2. There's a variety to choose from. Matter of fact, I think EverQuest 2 has one of the greatest variety of classes to choose from in the whole game. So, again, remember, this is geared towards the traditional classic server. So if you want to play on one of the progression servers, this guide is not going to mean a lot to you because that information is completely different than this information. So check out the other guides I've got on the TLE, progression servers, and beyond so that you can get your best out of whatever version you're going to be playing in EverQuest 2. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon, and I'll see everybody in the next live stream or in the next guide. Until then, safe gaming, have fun.